Okay, so once again, welcome to all of you. Today we continue our journey into different periods of American literature. In the first video, I gave you a very general overview of different time periods in the history of American literature. And one of the first things that I discussed, hi everyone, welcome. One of the first things that I discussed in the first video was that there is usually a lot of disagreement about the name of the periods and also the starting and the end dates for certain periods. But we followed the format presented to us in the Norton Anthology of American Literature because that's one of the most trusted sources all around the globe. And so we follow the structure presented to us in that book. And then the first chapter, of course, the first volume of that book is dedicated to literature from the beginnings of America up to 1820. And that's what we will talk about today. After we finish talking about today, which obviously I'm going to be this sole speaker, I'm going to send you a sample of a representative work of literature from this period. And again, if you remember the first video, I told you that I've had to make some very difficult decisions because by choosing to talk about Bradford's of Plymouth Plantation, I have discarded so many other fascinating writers of the period which you have to know about, but unfortunately we don't have enough time for. So please, if you are interested in the in American literature as much as I am, I strongly recommend you to go through all of the other writers as well, at least for your own pleasure reading. And if you don't have the Norton Anthology of American Literature, I do have the full PDFs for all of the 5 volumes. So please just let me know, and then I will send you the PDFs in our group. So um, let's start because today is going to be a little bit long. It's going to be a long lecture, and I really hope you'll have your teas and coffees ready because it might sound a little boring at some points, but I'll try to make it as interesting as possible. I'll send you the PDF as well. I promised to send some materials to a lot of students last week, but as I'm sure you know, I've been really busy and I will try to catch up with all of the promises I've made. Anyway, so that's what we are dealing with today: American literature from its beginnings up to 1820. Now, there are so many important issues that American writers, earliest writers, discuss in their works, but probably the most important one, and I'm sure you can guess, the most important one is obviously questions of identity. So a lot of people didn't really know who they were. No, obviously they know who they were. That's not what I mean. I mean they had a lot of questions about how life in this new world is gonna look like. Because don't forget that we do have Native Americans living in the American continent, on the American continent in North America. But then America didn't really become America until Europeans migrated to this new land. And that's why the year 1492 is such an important date because apologies, because it's when Christopher Columbus and his company and his men um, find this newfound land, and then uh, step by step, it becomes a fascination not only for England but also for all European countries which send ship after ship to this land of promise and create little colonies for themselves. So we have New England, we have New France, we have New Spain, and so America becomes a kind of a melting pot. یک دیگ جوشانی از فرهنگ‌های مختلف اروپاییه. آمریکا توی اون سالهای اول. And therefore, most of the writings written in this period are actually questions of, okay, well, what now? What then? Uh, who are we here? Because, well, we are men who have either traveled from Europe to America for business, or we have come here to start a new life, or we have escaped prosecution because a lot of people were, trying to run away from death, etc. And so they were really concerned about who they were. And this is true for everyone. The natives were suddenly, the land of the natives was suddenly invaded by these European immigrants and settlers, and they didn't know what life was. And so they were asking, I'm sorry, let me just drink some water. They were asking all of these questions of who are we in this new century, in this new age. The settlers as well, those immigrants also asked questions, the same questions. And when we talk about the settlers, obviously we have two different types of literature in this period. Let me just tell you what we are doing today. Today we talk about important historical and literary events from the beginnings up until 1820. Okay, so that's basically what we are doing. If we talk about the works produced by the settlers are those European immigrants. They fall into two categories: those people who object to settlement in America. They say, well, this was a ludicrous, a meaningless effort. We have to go back to Europe. And then we have justifications for settlement. So there are some people who say, no, we did a great thing. We have to continue our work here, even if it means killing native people, even if it means enslaving Africans and importing them from Africa. We have to continue the settlement in America. Now, one of the earliest writers that comes to mind, especially when it comes to American literature, was a guy named John Smith. Now, in 1631, John Smith publishes a very famous and influential book called Advertisements for the Unexperienced Planters of New England. Now, Smith himself was such an important figure because not only did he help the establishment and the founding of Jamestown in Virginia, one of the new cities in America, he also was influential in the establishment of another colony later as well. So that's why we talk about John Smith. So John Smith was a very influential figure, especially for the establishment of colonies, European colonies in America. That's why we look at him. That's why we talk about him. So he provided guidance for all of those English and European immigrants who were coming to the United States, both the Pilgrims and the Puritans, who actually came to the United States on a ship called the Mayflower, and they started their colonies, one of them in Plymouth and the other one in Massachusetts Bay. Before I talk about these Pilgrims and Puritans, because you have to know about them, I just want to say that John Smith was one of those. I brought John Smith right here at the beginning to tell you about an example of a person who was in favor of settlement. So John Smith was like, okay, yeah, we did a perfect thing. We have to continue this settlement. I'm going to help you uh, create new colonies in the United States. So John Smith, in this book, Advertisements for the Unexperienced Planters of New England, justifies the settlement. I will bring another example from a person who opposed, one of the native people who opposed settlement. Now, John Smith says this in his book: God did make the world to be inhabited with mankind, I'm reading here, and to have his name known to all nations and from generation to generation. Here in Florida, Virginia, New England, and Canada is more land than all people in the Christendom can manure or can cultivate. So John Smith is one of those people who favors settlement. And he says that, well, we have a lot of land here. God created all of this land, and he intended for this land to be inhabited by Christian people, by people of God. And we are doing absolutely the right thing by coming here and cultivating the people here and cultivating the land here. So, John Smith was one of those people who favored it. Now, before I continue bringing an example of a person who opposed this, I just want to talk about those pilgrims and Puritans that I have highlighted for you. Because a lot of the time, usually students ask, okay, who were those people who went to the United States? Who went to America? Sorry, because United States happened later. Who went to America? Now, as I said, people from all over Europe, Spain, I don't know, France, England, went to America. However, the most important groups of people who went to America and established colonies were from England. But who were they? Two groups of people went to America, the Pilgrims and the Puritans. The Pilgrims established their colony in Plymouth, and the Puritans established their colony in Massachusetts Bay almost 10 years later than the Pilgrims. But who were they? In order to know who the Pilgrims and the Puritans were, we have to talk about England, especially in the 17th century and even 18th century. Yes, of course, of course. We have so many books which justify slavery. We will talk about it in a few minutes. Now, when we think about Christianity, there are so many different versions of it. We call them denominations. Well, the first one and the main one was Catholicism, and Catholicism is the belief that God is the supreme power, and then after him, you have to trust the Pope and all of the other popes that came after the first Pope. So, this is a papal system, which means that if people want to talk to God, they have to talk to the Pope. They have to believe in the Pope. And they say that the main church is in Rome, right? Is in the Vatican. So this is Catholicism. The ultimate power is given to the Pope in Vatican. And then people have to follow this kind of faith. During the different stages of in the history of of English and even American literature, you hear another word as well, especially as I'm sure you know, you hear about a kind of reformation which occurred in the church and changed the Church of England from Catholicism or being Catholic to being Protestant, and it is called the Protestant Reformation. The Protestant Reformation argued that, yeah, God is the supreme power. It manifests itself in the Holy Trinity of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. But then they said that if you want to talk to God, if you want to find God, if you want to be a religious and a pious man, you don't really have to all the time do what the Pope says. You can read the Bible, you can follow the actions of Jesus and also his disciples, all of those men who were around Jesus, those disciples. So for Protestants, connecting with God was easier because you could just pick up the Bible and read the Old Testament and the New Testament, and there you are. You are talking with God, you are communicating with God, and you are following God's rules. You don't have to have another man like the Pope telling you what to do because you are directly connected to the source, to Jesus and his disciples. There was another form of religious denomination, especially in 17th and 18th century England, called Puritanism. Now, the Puritans were actually kind of like Protestants, but they said that you have to have a personal relationship with God. They call it the covenant. So they believed in having a direct personal relationship with God. I'm trying to tell you all of these differences in the simplest terms possible because different books can be very confusing. But Puritanism was talking about a pure kind of religion in which there is no in between, there is no go between. And so you can directly become a subject to God by covenant means a promise, a formal promise to God to be a good person. Yeah, Puritans also believe in God, in Jesus, in the disciples, in the Holy Trinity, but they say that the way to connect to God is neither through Pope, as the Catholics do, nor through the disciples of Jesus, but through a personal covenant, a personal promise to God to follow all of the rules yourself, right? That's it. That's very, very simply put, that's what Puritans were all about. Now, these Puritans were themselves divided into two groups. As you know, in 17th and 18th centuries, and starting in the 16th century and the Renaissance, and later on in the 17th century, the Church of England established itself as a separate entity from the Roman Catholic Church. But they also did something else. Yeah, they were a kind of Protestant church, but they also introduced politics into the church. That's why we call the Church of England a political church. Because now the head of the country, the king in the country, considered himself appointed by God. And therefore they said that my word is the word of God. That was the Church of England. And by church, I'm not using the Church of England as a general word. That's exactly the term that they used. These Puritans and Pilgrims were furious and they said that, okay, well, that's ridiculous. You are not the Pope. You are not one of Jesus's disciples. And if you want to relate to God, you can do it on a personal level. You cannot appoint yourself as the man of God to argue that my words are his words. So the Puritans were furious with the Church of England. But their level of fury, their level of anger differed. Some of them wanted to completely separate themselves from the Church of England and do their own unique kind of worship. But some of them were not separatists. They said they were reformists. They believed that they can do some kind of reform in the Church of England so that the Church of England finally comes back to its senses. These are the two groups of people who migrated to America. So the Pilgrims were the separatists. اینا جدایی طلب ها بودن که میگفتن چرچ آف انگلند امیدی به بهبودی و نمیدونم سر عقل اومدنش نیست. ما میخوایم کلا بریم و پرکتیس خودمون رو داشته باشیم. در نتیجه پیلگریم ها کسایی بودن که رفتن پلیموت و اونجا یک کلونی برای خودشون تشکیل دادن. پیوریتن ها رو به کسایی میگیم که جدایی طلب نبودن و حالا یه حالت اعتقاد داشتن به رفورمیشن. یعنی میگفتن که نه، ما میتونیم با بحث و جدل و لابی و غیره یه اصلاحاتی در چرچ آف انگلند انجام بدیم تا بالاخره بفهمیم که اونا هم یه چند قدم با جلو میان، یعنی با همون همکاری میکنن یا نه، و مطمئنیم که میشه به نتیجه رسید. So these were the people who immigrated to the United States, to America, I'm sorry, to America. So I just wanted to make that clear for you so that you understand what this Puritan or Pilgrim kind of difference is all about. So, as I said, when they migrated, the earliest examples of literature produced in that period was about whether or not settlement in America is a good thing. So people like John Smith believe that, yeah, it's absolutely right. We are doing God's work. He created all of this land for us and we have to inhabit it. But then there are some people who disagreed it. And those people, some of them were European. Yeah, some of them were European. But the most vocal of them was actually a native person, a native orator, یک سخنور یا یک از اینایی که سخنرانی های خیلی پرشوری انجام میدن. A native orator who followed the techniques provided to him by Seneca. So he was an intelligent man. He had read, for example, ancient Greece, and he was familiar with it. I have written here for you here, Saguiautha. So he actually responded to people like John Smith, who said that they are doing God's work by civilizing people. افرادی مثل جان اسمیت میگفتن اینا همشون وحشی هستن، این نیتیوا. ما داریم مثلا کار خدا رو انجام میدیم که اینا رو سیویلایز میکنیم، متمدن میکنیم به اصطلاح. Now these native writers actually opposed it and they wrote a rebuttal. یک جوابیه نوشتن به John Smith. And so this is a direct quotation from Saguiotha. There was a time when our forefathers owned this great land. Their seats extended from the rising to the setting sun as شرق آمریکا به غرب آمریکا و غیره. The Great Spirit had made it for the use of Indians. We say Indian Americans. Indian American همون نیتیو هست. منظورمون هندیا نیستن. Indian Americans همون یا Indians اینجا منظورمون نیتیو های آمریکا هستن. بعد اینجا یه چیز خیلی جالبه میگه وقتی شما اومدین when your forefathers arrived، میگه وقتی که نیاکان شما از همون کریستوفر کولومبوس 1492 از اون موقع اومدن they found friends and not enemies. ما باشون دوستانه برخورد کردیم، ما دوستشون بودیم. They told us that they had fled from their own country for fear of wicked men. به ما گفتن که اینجا منظور fled، اینا فرار کرده بودن از کشورشون چون میترسیدن از اینکه شاید اونجا یه بلایی سرشون بیاد. And had come here to enjoy the religion. They asked us for a small seat. بهمون گفتن یه تکه کوچیکی به ما بدین، ما همونجا میشینیم کارمون رو انجام میدیم. We took pity on them. ما دلمون براشون سوخت. Granted their request. و خواستشون رو برآورده کردیم. They sat down among us. و اونو به اصطلاح میگه اونا رو به جمع خودمون راه دادیم. Exactly, Adel, exactly. That, we are the saviors, we want to save you. This was the argument of the European whites. And then he says that as soon as you try to sit down، یعنی میگه به محض اینکه نشستی پاشونو باز کردن که فضای بیشتری رو بگیرن. بعد کم کم گفتن ما اینجا جا نمیشیم، باید کلونیای بیشتری رو به اصطلاح استابلیش کنیم تا میگه جای ما رو کامل شما گرفتیم. So this is an example of a person who wrote against John Smith. I wanted to just point that out, that this is one of the earliest kinds of writing that we have in America, discussing whether or not settlement was good for the natives or not. Now, we want to talk about another important work which was published, in the 18th century in America, because it tells us how life was like in those days. So as I told you, today we are talking about important historical events and important books which were written. این پاورپوینت هم بچه از روی همون چپتر اول کتاب نورتون درست شده، ولی خب اون چپتر حاوی خیلی اطلاعات زیادی، 25-6 صفحه است. من قشنگ گلچین کردم براتون که دیگه از این راحت تر نمیشه که دیگه اون چپتر هم کامل نخوندین این نکات مهمشه که برای شما در مقطع کارشناسی ضروری. In 1782 a French writer called Hector John Crevecoeur publishes a very, very famous book called Letters from an American Farmer. But the book is interesting for us because it actually has a very fascinating question at the heart of it. And the question is, well, what is an American? یکی از اولین، باز میگیم هنوز داریم راجع به questions of identity صحبت میکنیم. من برای تمامی کلاسام پاورپوینت هم آپلود میکنم حتما اگر باشه. Okay, so Crevacore asks a very critical question that who is this new American that we're all talking about? What is an American? Because, well, America is a combination of like English people, French people, native people, Spanish people. What is an American? What are the qualities that can be used to describe a person as American? And Crevacore offers his explicit answer to this answer by saying that an American is a new man. یعنی کسی که به گذشته دیگه اعتقادی نداره و این افق روشن رو جلوی خودش میبینه. Who acts upon new principles. And he must therefore entertain new ideas and form new opinions. میگه اگه اون عقاید قدیمی رو داری تو دیگه واقعا یک آمریکایی نیستی. آمریکایی کسیه که به عقاید جدید و به این دنیای جدید اعتقاد داره و در واقع باید به چیزای جدیدی فکر کنه. As I said, well, there were a lot of people from different backgrounds in America in that age. English people, Scotch, Irish people, French people, Dutch, Germans, Swedes, etc. There are all kinds of religions here. We have Catholics, we have Quakers, we have Protestants, we have Puritans, as we discussed. And so he says that, and it is for the first time that this word is used actually. He calls it a melting place. We can call it a melting pot. همونطور که گفتم یه دیگ جوشانیه که انواع و اقسام ادویجات رو شما توش ریختین و حالا قراره یک غذای خوشمزه ای از دل این بیرون بیاد که اسمش یک آمریکاییه به اصطلاح. So it is a melting pot, okay? And so he says that it is a melting pot, a combination of different cultures who are present here. And there are all kinds of people here. People who are here who are looking for new adventures, people who are here for business because they saw an opportunity, people who are actually here because they are escaping death, who people or Europeans here who are trying to liberate themselves from all of those rules of the old world. And so we have to learn to coexist. And then in the rest of the book, he talks about, life in America. He talks about the beauties of life in America, the attractions of this new frontier, of this new kind of land, all the beauties of it. But he also talks about the horrors which were going on in those early periods. And this is a very good segue. این یه به اصطلاح میتونه یه کانکتر خوبی باشه به بحث بعدیمون که حالا میخوایم راجع به بردهداری و سیاه‌پوستان و اینا صحبت کنیم توی آمریکا. So Crevacore also talks about the horrors, not just the beauties of this land, but also the horrors of this book, especially those slaves, African American slaves who were put through so much. And so because this book gave people a very vivid image of what life was like in the United States, America, in that age, well, it became a sensational hit. This is probably one of the earliest bestsellers, if we can call it. Letters from an American Farmer, because it posed an important question: what is an American? It described about the demographic features, یعنی ویژگی‌های جمعیتی رو برمیشمره، کجایی هستن، چه دین‌هایی دارن و غیره. And it also discusses, some chapters of it discuss the kind of experience that people went through, both enjoying the beauties of it and, of course, some people experiencing some horrific kinds of life in this period. And the same thing, the reason we will talk about Washington Irving in our next stage when we talk about the American Renaissance. But I've actually brought the name of Washington Irving here because Washington Irving's short story that we will discuss in this course, RIP, is actually he was actually very much influenced by Crevacore's book. And so that's why we want to see this connection that later on, when 2 sessions from now, 3 sessions from now, we talk about Washington Irving, you realize where he got the inspiration to write about this period. اون کتاب کریوکور انقدر سنسیشنال بود، انقدر محبوب بود که روی خیلی از نویسنده‌های اون دوره، نه تنها مردمان عادی که سواد خوندن و نوشتن داشتن، که روی نویسنده‌های بعدی هم تاثیر گذاشت، که حالا توی ایج بعدی که راجع به واشنگتن ایروینگ و داستان ریپ ون وینکلش صحبت میکنیم، قشنگ صحبت میکنیم که چطور این نویسنده آمریکایی که یکی از اولین نویسنده هایی بود که به شهرت ادبی رسید، یعنی به عنوان یک نویسنده به شهرت رسید، صحبت میکنیم، قشنگ میدونیم که این تاثیر کتاب کروکوره که اینجا میاد و در واقع راجع به این دوره و زندگی توی اون دوره صحبت میکنه، از اینجا نشأت گرفته. اینم صرفا یه نکته تکمیلی خواستم بهتون بگم. اما این کتاب هایی که در مورد هویت آمریکایی بودن نوشته شده، بررسیشون بدون صحبت کردن به اینکه از کجا اومدن این مردمان عملا غیر ممکنه. شما راجع به هویت یه نفر میتونید صحبت کنید، ولی اولین سوالی که معمولا میپرسین که کیه، اهل کجاست. میپرسی کیه، اهل کجاست، از کجا اومده. دونستن این که یه نفر از کجا اومده عملا به درک هویتش بیشتر کمک میکنه. That's why the second idea that we are talking about today is exploring the origins of American people. Where did they come from? And how their unique cultures back home, because most of them were immigrants, how their unique cultures back home influenced who they became in America. And so questions of identity and origin are very much interrelated. Now, we talked about some of those things which talk about some of the books that discuss the identity of people, who they are, etc., etc. But let's not also forget that most of the earliest writings, even before John Smith and all of those questions of, is settlement good or bad, most of these questions, most of the books written even before them were exploring the origins. They were narratives of discovery about the first people who went to America. یعنی ما قبل از اون آثاری که به هویت و نمیدونم اینکه ستلمنت اونجا خوب بوده یا نه بپردازیم، حتی قبل از اونم آثاری داشتیم که حالا شاید ارزش ادبی نداشتن، ولی آثاری بودن که راجع به دیسکاوری اون کشور، اون قاره و اون سرزمین برای ما نوشته شده. یعنی طرف اومده نوشته که من از کریستوفر کلمبوس هم شروع میکنیم، من این به اصطلاح سرزمین جدید رو پیدا کردم، بعد مهاجرای دیگه هم اومدن، اونا هم راجع به مثلا شوق و ذوقشون از دیدن این کشور جدید برامون در واقع نوشتن. And so these books in general, these narratives of discovery, individually and collectively, each one of them separately, if you look at them, or if you look at them as a whole, all of these writings of or narratives of discovery talk about some kind of confrontation, the confrontation between the Europeans and, of course, the natives, and, of course, later on, the African people who are imported as slaves. So if I ask you a question in your final exam that what are the earliest kinds of writing produced in America, you should say that they were narratives of discovery, which focused on the origins of the people, and they also included confrontations between different types of people, the natives and the immigrants, and then later on the immigrants and the slave that they had imported for labor from Africa, a process that we call the middle passage. این ترمینولوژی هم بد نیست بچه‌ها بلد باشین. این اولین اجازه بدین براتون بنویسم. اولین به اصطلاح نقل و انتقال سیاه پوستان از قاره آفریقا به آمریکا برای بردهداری رو بهش میگن the middle passage. پس این هم بد نیست حالا توی ذهنتون داشته باشید. Okay, so as I said, this is what they were about. So we start with Christopher Columbus himself. Columbus's own writing is the perfect example. As we said, a date which is so important for us, its importance cannot be overstated, is 1492, which is the date that Christopher Columbus sets his voyage in motion and finally and ultimately discovers America, so to speak. He recounts a year later, he recounts his experiences of the voyage of finding America, and then his amazement in a book called Letter to Louis do Santagal, or it's a very difficult name to pronounce, regarding the first voyage. So, letters to Louis de Santangel regarding the first voyage. This is the book written by Columbus himself, in which he discusses his first encounter and انقدر میگم اسم نه اینکه دنبال بهونه باشه، مثلا میگم انقدر کتاب اسمش طولانی و سخته که خود آمریکایی هم سادهش کردن، میگن Letter of Discovery، یعنی اصلا اسم کتابش رو گذاشتن Letter of Discovery. So the Letter of Discovery, written by Christopher Columbus, talks about his encounter, his account of the territory that he had discovered with all of his European allies. And it includes some of the most fascinating descriptions of the beauties that he encountered in this new land, and also his interactions with the natives of the and the people there. Now, just keep in mind that obviously there was no verbal communication between them because they didn't know each other's languages. So, Christopher Columbus praises this beautiful land, the mountains, the vegetation, the trees, everything, the rivers, the valleys. But then, when it comes to the people, the native people there, he says a very interesting sentence. Now, Christopher Columbus, for us Iranians, have always been a great person. We say, okay, well, he discovered America, blah, blah, what a great man. But for Americans themselves, he was a symbol of brutality and force and death and destruction. So Christopher Columbus is not looked upon as a hero among the, at least the native Indian Americans, or even in the history of America. He's considered as a cruel man. And just look at this very revealing sentence in his book. He says, "In this first island that I came to, I took some of them by force." یعنی قشنگ میره نیتیوا رو زندانی میکنه، به زور اینا رو میبره برای کار و بعد اینا رو میندازه تو کشتیش، از خانوادهشون جدا میکنه که ببره اروپا، که نشون بده ببینید من این آدم رو مثلا کشف کردم توی یه جزیره. خیلی از اینایی که باش میرن حالا بعدن میان و اونا هم راجع به جذابیت های اروپا برای مثلا هم نوعان خودشون یعنی برمیگردن یه سریشون، ولی خیلی هاشون هم میمیرن توی راه. So Christopher Columbus, yeah, found the American continent. But what is also fascinating is that he was also a brute. He took them by force. He separated them from their families. And so this is a very revealing sentence, which is kind of like a foreshadowing for you of what is going to happen in the next few years. So when Christopher Columbus just sees people and then takes them by force, completely disregarding their humanity, their societies, you can probably guess what happened next. And what happened next is that more and more Europeans came to America, and then step by step we do have some records, some historical records that show us that native people started dying in very large numbers. There were a lot of diseases that came to America, by Europeans, like smallpox, measles, and typhus. And those diseases were nothing. They were nothing compared to the brutality that these natives experienced, especially in terms of enslavement. Because Europeans wanted to build colonies, and Europeans needed labor, they needed the workforce. So they tried to capture Indians and put them to work, enslave them. And when some Indians fought back, Europeans said, okay, well, let's go to Africa and bring some people. And so we have this slave trade. We have this slave trade in America as well. Yeah, slave trade had been established before in Europe. ما از 1441 تقریبا slave trade داریم. حتی 1452 پوپ که قدرتمندترین فرد در کلیسای کاتولیکه اعلام کرده بود که آره غیر مسیحی ها رو شما میتونید به عنوان برده به کار ببرید. مثلا اسلیوری یه چیز کاملا معمولی بود. ولی بعدش اومدن اسلیوری رو هم توی آمریکا پیاده سازی کردن و قشنگ توی اون میدل پسیج دسته دسته افراد رو از آفریقا منتقل میکردن به آمریکا برای بردهداری و کار روی اون پلانتیشن ها و به اصطلاح مزارعشون در واقع. Columbus himself tried to establish a slave trade and a market for it. So, but of course, the practice failed. But he began this tradition, unfortunately, and so Europeans started transporting huge numbers of enslaved Africans to the America after arriving there, and it was Spain that introduced African slavery in the United States as early as 1501. 1501. So the history of America is full of brutality and darkness, especially when it comes to African people. Now, it is also fascinating for you, it might be fascinating for you to know that there were a lot of slave rebellions. So slaves were not really passive people. Some of them had rebellions, killing, for example, the Spanish people, forming, for example, groups to formally protest their conditions. But unfortunately, we don't hear about this in literature. یه نکته رو خارج از محیط کلاسمون بهتون بگم. البته فکر کنم توی درس نقد ادبیتون بخونید این رو. این ترم نقد ادبی دارین شما یا هنوز؟ نقد ادبی رو دارین بچه‌ها؟ رویکردهای ادبی، رویکردهای نقد ادبی. خب خیلی عالی، خیلی عالی. این بهتون کمک میکنه. حالا ان وقتی که به اون رسیدین یک مکتب انتقادی رو بهتون درس خواهد داد استادتون، امیدوارم بهتون بگه، به اسم Critical Race Theory. Critical Race Theory در واقع نقد نژاد مبنا بهش میگن که به موقعیت و لایف اکسپریانس افریکن امریکنز میپردازه توی ادبیات. یکی از چیزایی که این نقد بهش میپردازه پاک شدن کامل اسلیف ها از تاریخ آمریکا توی کتاب ها بوده تا همین چند دهه پیش. یعنی اصلا نه اشاره‌ای به قیام های اسلیف ها میکرده که نشون بده بابا اینا افراد اکتیوی بودن، افراد آگاهی بودن. همیشه سعی میکردن اون برده های رنگین پوست یا سیاه پوست رو به عنوان یک سری افراد مثلا کنذهنی نشون میدن که متشکر بودن از اربابانشون به خاطر این سقفی که بالا سرشون قرار داده بودن، یا اینکه مثلا هر روز یه ذره غذا بهشون میدادن و اگه اونا نبودن از گشنگی مثلا میمردن اسلیف ها. این رو توی کریتیکال ریس تیوری خیلی مبحث فوق العاده جذابیه، بهش خواهید پرداخت انشالله توی درس رویکردهای نقد ادبیتون. ولی خب اینا اینجا براتون آوردم. CRT یه مکتب نقد بسیار جدیده، بسیار بسیار جدید، شاید 40-50 ساله باشه و بیشتر و بیشتر روی آثار ادبیات به اصطلاح افریکن امریکن و فرم های مختلف اون در واقع فوکس میکنه. خب اینم از اون تیلایی که بهتون گفتم، Tales of Origins، که همچین کتابایی از جمله کتاب کریستوفر کولومبوس به اون به اصطلاح آریجین مردم میپردازن که از کجا اومده و بعدش خب ما میدونیم که اتفاق مهم دیگه ای که رخ میده اینه که متاسفانه اسلیوری توی آمریکا شکل میگیره. حالا بیشتر بریم راجع به اون لیترری سین، اون اصلا چشمانداز ادبی که توی این دوره حضور داشته، مخصوصا از بعد 1492 بعد 1492 که اون اتفاق تاریخی کشف آمریکا و اون حالت رو رخ میده. ببینیم از اون به بعد بالاخره آمریکا ادبیاتش به چه سوی میره. Now in that period, most of the works written in ancient Greece and Rome, the classics of literature, so to speak, were known to everyone. And they were read by everyone. So people read all kinds of classic literature written by important writers in Greece and Rome. And some of the most important continental works, continental منظورم قاره اروپاست، اونم باز برای خیلی از کسایی که حالا ساکن آمریکا بودن آشنا بود. مثلا با اشعاری مثل شعر بیولف آشنا بودن، سانگ آف رولند فرانسوی با اون آشنا بودن، دیواین کامدی رو از ایتالیا میشناختن، سر گاوین اند گرین نایت رو میدونستن از نویسنده ناشناس. و امسال هم یه اقتباس خیلی قشنگ ازش اومدم این چند وقت پیش به اسم گرین نایت. اگه فیلمشو ندیدین و دوست دارین این اثر رو بخونین، اقتباس فوق‌العاده ای ازش بود. فیلم گرین نایت رو دف پاتل هم توش بازی کرد، اون بازیگر هندی که چند سال پیش برای اسلام داگ توی اسلام داگ میلیونر بازی کرد و اسکار رو برد اون فیلم. So Sir Gawain and the Green Knight was kind of like a familiar work of literature. Les of Marie de France, another work which was important. Decameron by Boccaccio, which was a collection of stories, was important. Its English example, Canterbury Tales by William Chaucer, was actually important. A lot of people also were familiar with poetry of the sonnets of Petrarch, and of course, Shakespearean sonnets as well. Now, I'm going to ask you a very weird question, which is completely unrelated to American literature, but do you guys know the difference between Petrarchan sonnets and Shakespearean sonnets? چیزی که باید توی درس شعر یا فنون و صنعات ادبی خونده باشین. اگه کسی داوطلبه بگین تا میکروفونش رو فعال کنم، راجع به تفاوت‌های پترارکن و شکسپیریان سانت ببینم چی یادتونه. Anyone? Okay. Well, you know that the earliest kinds of sonnet were Italian sonnets, and the Petrarchan sonnet is a perfect example of it. Now, Petrarchan sonnets were, about the format, the stanzas, they are different. About the rhyme scheme is different, and the subject matter is also different. The Petrarchan consists of two different parts: the first 8 lines and the final 6 lines, which are called the octave and the sestet. They're usually about the predicaments of a lover, because the woman does not really respond to her begging, and then finally the resolution, which comes in the last 6 lines. But the Shakespearean sonnet had a lot of change. For Shakespeare, Shakespeare obviously did a lot of changes to make the sonnet English. And one of the things that he did was that he changed this kind of 8-line, 6-line format and turned it into 3 quatrains and a couplet at the end. And so also the subject matter changed. Now Shakespeare could make fun of the lover instead of just of the beloved, instead of just praising the beloved blindly in a kind of unrequited love. And so these are some of the changes that he introduced. Anyway, let's forget about that. Now, as we said, when in 1983 Columbus's letter of discovery was published, another important thing happened in the history of the world, which democratized literature, which means that it made literature available to more and more people. And that was the introduction of the printing press in 1485. So very close to when Columbus's letter of discovery was published. William Caxton's printing press was also a very, very important introduction into the world of print, because it made literature more democratic. It made literature more available and accessible. So we also focus on this by arguing that step by step, more and more writers felt the confidence that they could write literature, and more readers were also becoming literate and knowledgeable enough to start reading literature. And so, now literature was not just in the hands of some bard in the court of some king. Now everybody could write literature and have it published. It was still a very expensive and difficult process, but less so than, the time before William Caxton's printing press. And so a lot of explorers and adventurers produced a very interesting body of literature which communicated to normal people, ordinary people, the wonders of this new world. Now, if you were an adventurer back then, you could write your own book. If you were an explorer, you could write your own book. And so we see a lot of books from this period offering explanations and justifications for exploration in America, or you see some people who say, no, this is a terrible decision, etc. Also, let's not forget that before the Europeans arrived, there was literature in America, but the problem is that it was oral. So, native people did have a kind of oral culture and oral literature. Some of them, like the Aztecs, especially in the continent of America, had kind of a writing system which they used to preserve their literature and writing, but the oral literature was of the natives was also very much influenced. Okay, and so the early American literature that we discussed, the beginnings up until 1820, is again a combination of all different kinds of literature: the literature of the settlers, the oral literature of the natives, and of course, literature in different languages. Literature in French written in America, literature in Spanish written in America, and literature in English written in America. So it was also a very diverse body of works. Now, I told you at the beginning of today's session, I talked about John Smith, and I talked about the influential book that John Smith wrote, his book for the inexperienced kind of settlers in the New England. And I told you that this book was influential because it talked about justifying the settlement of Europeans in America. Now, um, John Smith had a friend. Now, John Smith had a friend called Thomas Harriot. He was also a very influential figure, so you have to know about him too. Now, Harriot also produced, the first account, as we say, of the life of English people who had immigrated to America. کتاب آقای هریت از این بابت برام مهمه، تامس هریت، که اولین کتابه که در مورد تجربه انگلیسی ها در آمریکا صحبت میکنه. میگم کتابای دیگه بوده که مثلا راجع به تجربیات فرانسوی ها، اسپانیایی ها منتشر شده، اما کتاب هریت رو به این دلیل اینجا براتون آوردم که اولین کتابیه که سعی میکنه از تجربه انگلیسی هایی که از کشور انگلیس و بریتانیا آمده بودن صحبت کنه. اسم کتابش هم هست A Brief and True Report of the Newfound Land of Virginia, which of course talks about all of the remarkable features of this new land, as well as, for example, the natives who lived there, their beliefs and their customs, and how English people try to kind of connect with the native people. John Smith was also another important figure who talked about this as well. And so these two important writers talked about life in New England. گفتم هر کشوری یک کلونی تأسیس میکرد اسمش رو میذاشت مثلا نیو فرانس، نیو سپین. این دوتا نویسنده رو اینجا براتون آوردم به دو دلیل. یکی اون بحث جاستیفیکیشن ستلمنت و دومم این که این دو نفر کسایی بودن که اولین آثار رو در مورد نیو انگلند نوشتن، تجربه انگلیسی های حاضر در آمریکا، که میگم کیا بودن دیگه گفتم بهتون، پیلگریمز و پیوریتنز ها، که راجع به تفاوتاشون با هم دیگه صحبت کردیم. توی سال 1620 بچه‌ها یه اتفاق خیلی مهمی میفته، خیلی مهم، فوق العاده مهم، یعنی این رو حتما تو نکته برداریاتون داشته باشین. یه شهر رو بالاخره ببین اکثر شهرهای اون موقع حول یه سری مزارع تشکیل شده بودن. یه مزرعه و یه شهری اطرافش استابلیش میشه به اسم پلیمت. این پلیمت برای ما خیلی خیلی مهمه. چرا؟ چون تأثیر بسیار زیادی بر آینده ادبی آمریکا گذاشت. So this Plymouth Plantation, which was established in 1620, creates a new age for literature in North America. Now, when those pilgrims and those Puritans came to the United States, came to America, they landed in this kind of place, which was called Plymouth. And they later on, some of them went to Massachusetts Bay. So they created a kind of community for themselves. These pilgrims created a community for themselves. But of course, it was a very, very hard situation for them because they had just come from a new country. They had just come to a new country. They didn't have any experience, and unfortunately, when they arrived, it was winter, and so surviving this harsh winter was really, really difficult for them. It was so important. This event was so important that one of the people that is a perfect example of a writer from this period, someone whose work I have selected and I have included in the syllabus, and we are going to read his work for next week, actually wrote about this experience. And this was William Bradford's Of Plymouth Plantation، اثری که توی سال 1630 منتشر میشه که راجع به تجربیات این پیلگریم ها هستش که از کیا بودن که توضیح دادم براتون، کیا بودن، چرا اومدن، توضیح دادم بهتون چرا اومدن و حالا چه تجربه‌ای در اینجا داشتن. کتاب Of Plymouth Plantation خیلی اثر ادبی مهمیه برای ما، چون تجربیات این پیلگریم های انگلیسی رو به تصویر میکشه و این اون اثریه که ما میخوایم از این دوره بخونیم. من از کتاب Of Plymouth Plantation یه چپترش رو براتون انتخاب کردم که برای هفته آینده بخونیم و راجبش بحث کنیم. چپترهای اول و دوم و سوم ایناشو حذف کردم چون توی اون دلایل اینکه پیلگریم ها کی بودن و دلایل اومدنشون چی بود رو نوشته که خودم امروز براتون توضیح دادم. اون چپتری رو براتون انتخاب کردم، نمیدونم چند صفحه است، 5-6 صفحه است. شما به عنوان دانشجوی ادبیات باید اثر زیاد بخونید و خب من انتظار دارم جلسه آینده حتما کلش رو خونده باشید. توی اون چپتری که براتون انتخاب کردم آقای برادفورد میگه که حالا چه تجربه‌ای داشتن توی اون ماه‌های اول. ما میدونیم کی بودن، توضیح دادم کی بودن، از کجا اومدن، چرا اومدن. حالا میخوایم ببینیم که وقتی رسیدن چه تجربه‌ای داشتن. پس این اثری که براتون انتخاب کردم و برای به نمایندگی از کل آثار این دوره بیگینینگز تا 1820 میخونیم از کتاب Of Plymouth Plantation آقای ویلیام برادفورد که به تجربه این پیلگریم ها میپردازه. Okay, so this is what we will discuss next week. But before we discuss it next week, let me just tell you something, because again, one of the questions that a lot of people ask is that so the first people who went to America were all like religious people, pilgrims and Puritans. So was it all a spiritual journey because they wanted to establish a new church? They wanted to explore, for example, a new kind of religion or denomination for themselves? No. Most of the migrations to the United States were actually commercial. People saw an opportunity for a new market and they actually went on these long journeys because they believed that this land was a land of opportunity. And so I just want you to know that most of the people who went on this famous ship, the Mayflower ship, the name of the ship is also important. This is the name of the ship that brought all of these pilgrims to the United States. Most of them were actually looking for business and not just for religious reasons. So I told you that in 1620, this Plymouth colony was formed by the Pilgrims. And I told you at the beginning of the class that 10 years later, the Puritans also came to the United States and they went to Massachusetts Bay. همه اینا رو کنار هم بذارین خلاصش تا همینجا میشه چی؟ دو گروه از مردم بودن، پیلگریم ها و پیوریتن ها. پیلگریم ها 1620 اومدن توی پلیموث ساکن شدن و تجربیاتشون رو ما توی کتاب Of Plymouth Plantation داریم. پیوریتن ها 10 سال بعد اومدن، یعنی هی داشتن تلاش میکردن رفورمیشن، اصلاحات انجام بدن. توی انگلیس میگفتن ما جدایی طلب نیستیم، ما میشینیم تلاش میکنیم چرچ آف انگلند. آقا دیدن نمیتونن، بعد 10 سال توی 1630 سوار یک کشتی شدن اومدن، ولی دیگه نرفتن پلیموث، رفتن ماساچوستس بی. اونجا خیلی کلونی بزرگتری رو تشکیل دادن. نماینده و فرماندهشون که بعدها یک کتاب از تجربیاتشون نوشت آقای جان وینتراپ بود. این دوتا نویسنده رو باید بشناسین. پیلگریم ها و پیوریتن ها رو باید بدونین، اینکه کجا ساکن شدن رو باید بدونین. دوتا کتابی که تجربیات اینها رو به تصویر میکشه هم باید بدونین. So A Model for Christian Charity is the name of the book by John Winthrop. uh, who talks about this experience of the Puritans in the Massachusetts Bay. Okay, let's move forward and talk about another important event which happened in this period, the Salem witch trials. Now, up to now, I haven't really talked about women and the fact that we haven't talked about it says that, of course, they were unfortunately mistreated just like the African slaves in this period. Now, unfortunately, women even were more harshly treated than even African men because, well, they were experiencing double levels of oppression. And so African men were only oppressed because they were not white, because they were black. But women, especially African women, were treated even worse in a very terrible way because not only were they not men, but also they were not black, they were not white. So there were two levels of oppression occurring to them. One of the other things which happened to them was that suddenly they were accused of being possessed by devil. So the first person who was accused of being a witch in this period, I will tell you why suddenly there was this kind of weird and strange and crazy thing going on. People accusing that, hey, this woman is possessed, this woman is a witch, and they would burn them. They would kill them and burn them. I will tell you why, what was the political and the social situation that created this fear. But before that, I just wanted to tell you that women were living in terrible conditions. And so in Salem, all kinds of women were accused of being a witch. And then they were killed, they were burned, they were executed. And I just wanted to say that when I said that African women were experiencing even more oppression, the first woman to be accused, not to be killed, that was someone else. The first woman to be accused of witchcraft was a black slave called Tituba. So, this name is again very important for us because she's the first slave girl, black girl, to be accused of witchcraft. So, it's important for us. But then, of course, more and more women were accused, and suddenly I've brought Salem witch trials for you. Please read the PowerPoint presentations because I don't want the class to be boring and long. So you can read all of this. But it started in the spring of 1692 when suddenly uh, a lot of people started accusing other women of being a witch. And so, uh, and there were some reasons for it. You know, life was difficult in general, and so the Puritan community was a very strict community. Nobody had any power to, to do something that God did not approve. Do you remember the Puritans? We said that they believed that you should promise to God to be good all the time, and therefore, when somebody was not good, well, they usually punished him or her severely. So, the realities of living in a Puritan community, the difficulties of different kinds of wars which was going on between competing forces. Let's not forget that Spanish people, French people, and English people were not living in peace. They were fighting with each other to expand their colonies. All of this, and as well as epidemics and diseases, suddenly somebody was sick and they had no knowledge of, for example, mental problems. And so when a person was under a lot of stress and he or she reacted in a special way, suddenly they accused him or her of being possessed, mostly women, of course. And therefore, a lot of people were entangled in this terrible, terrible event, and a lot of them, of course, died. I just wanted to point that out that, again, the first one was a slave girl. So, this is also another important event that happened during this period. And let's now talk about the. Yes, of course, of course. Thank you, Adil. Um, so, وقتی که به ادبیات مدرن آمریکا برسیم، حالا راجع به نمایشنامه‌های مختلف و راجع به آثار مختلفی که برمیگردن و به این دوره میپردازن صحبت میکنیم. به عنوان مثال از آرتور میلر صحبت خواهیم کرد قطعا، و یه اثر دیگه هم که توی ادبیات قرن 19 بهش میپردازیم که راجع به همین دوره جامعه پیوریتن هست، البته به صورت یک اثر تخصصی نه، ولی توی جلساتی بهش اشاره میکنیم. اسکارلت لتر آقای ناتانیال هاترنه که به همین دوره و زندگی توی همچین جامعه‌ای برمیگرده. راجع به این صحبت خواهیم کرد. آره دیگه، کانسپت میستریتمنت آف ویمن که حالا بهش بگیم میسانجنی، خب توی اون دوره وجود داشته. حالا راجع به تو بخش آخر که راجع به ایدئال های جامعه آمریکایی بود براتون صحبت میکنم که این ایدئال های جامعه آمریکایی که یکیش مثلا هپینس و آزادی بود، آزادی برای زنان نبود، برای مردان سفید پوست بود. یعنی اون بحث جنسیتی وجود داشت. یه دستبندی هایرارکی اگه بخوایم انجام بدیم، خوشبخت‌ترینشون میشه یک مرد سفید پوست آمریکایی، بعدش حالا مثلا زن سفید پوست هم جایگاه بدی نداره ولی خب در درجه ثانویه قرار داره، بعدش میشه یک مرد سیاه پوست و بعدش میشه یک زن به اصطلاح رنگین پوست یا سیاه پوست. The other important global event that happened in this period, which was very, very influential, not only in Europe, but also in America, was the Enlightenment movement. Now, we usually know the Enlightenment as the Age of Reason. Enlightenment یا عصر روشنگری به اصطلاح دوره‌ای بود که توش اون عقاید و خرافات مثلا قرنهای قبل زیر سوال رفت، مردم به ساینس اعتقاد پیدا کردن، به ریزن و عقل و منطق اعتقاد پیدا کردن و میگفتن که هر چیزی باید بر اساس عقل و منطق باشه. تئوریای ساینتیفیک جای خرافات رو گرفتن و کلاً the Age of Enlightenment was an influential European movement that also had its influence in the United States. Now, the reason why I'm talking about in the Enlightenment is because of two things. A lot of people usually misunderstand the Enlightenment and say that because it was the age of reason, it was the age of scientific discourse, suddenly everyone was godless, suddenly everyone was secular, and Enlightenment created secularization all around the world. But this is not the case. Most of the philosophers of the Enlightenment were actually people who believed in God. The only difference with the religious people of the previous century was that they deduced به این نتیجه، این استدلال و این استنتاج و نتیجه گیری رو داشتن که they deduced the existence of God not based on the Bible but based on the world. And they said that look at the beautiful natural world. Absolutely, there is a creator here. And this creator, this kind of philosophy of religion is called deism, or the natural religion. When you decide that God exists, not based on scripture or religious text, but based on the world and how orderly it is. And so most of these people were not secular, were not atheists, were not godless. They believed in God, but they the conclusion that God exists came from a separate thing. Yeah, of course, we will talk about the Harlem Renaissance later on in the 1920s. Now, another important reason why I included the Enlightenment in the presentation today is Immanuel Kant's idea of tutelage, which was very, very influential in America. Tutelage means that Immanuel Kant believed that, well, in the previous pages, Immanuel Kant was a famous philosopher who had a huge impact on the Enlightenment movement. But one idea of his was probably more important than the rest, and that's the idea of tutelage, which is Immanuel Kant argues that in order to understand the world and to understand life, You don't need to be tutored. You don't need to have a tutor like your parents, like your family, like your teacher. You don't need to learn about the world from other people. You can find out about the world yourself. You can be you can be your own researcher. You can understand the world just by trusting your own beliefs and your own mind and uh, your own life. This idea had an everlasting influence on the literature of the next stage in America, 1820 to 1865, which we know as the age of transcendentalism. Because most of the writers in that age, including Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, Nathaniel Hawthorne, even, they were all influenced by this idea and they named it self-reliance for themselves. یکی از معروفترین کتاب‌های امرسن که راجبش خواهیم خوند و راجبش صحبت میکنیم توی دوره بعدی، یا اصلا یه کتابیه به اسم Self Reliance. آمریکایی ها از این ایده مانیول کانت استفاده کردن برای خلق یک، بهش میگن ایثاس یعنی اون قوه، اون قدرت محرکه‌ای که یک ملت رو به جلو میبره. و این رو در تمامی از 1820 به بعد بگیر تا همین الانش به عنوان یکی از اصلی ترین ایدئال های هویت آمریکایی بهش میپردازم. اونم چیه؟ ایندیویدوالیسم یا فردگرایی. یعنی از این ایده انلایتنمنت استفاده کردن برای تولید کانسپتی که نه تنها هویت آمریکایی بلکه ادبیات آمریکایی از 1820 تا همین الانش رو تحت تاثیر قرار میده. بحث ایندیویدوالیسم یا فردگرایی، هر عصری از ادبیات آمریکا رو شما در نظر بگیرین، آثارش ایندیویدوالیسم رو برترین ایدئال زندگیشون میدونن. از دوره ترانسندنتالیسم بگیرین تا دوره رئالیسم و ناتورالیسم دوره ادبیات آمریکا. مثلا توی اثری مثل ماجراهای هاکلبری فین مثلا ما این رو داریم. توی دوره ترانسندنتالیسم تمامی کتاب‌های نویسنده ها از سلف ریلاینس امرسن بگیرید که ایندیویدوالیسم رو ترویج میده، از والدن هنری دیوید تارو بگیرید که میگه من میرم تو جنگل تنها زندگی میکنم، به هیچ کی نیاز ندارم. از دوره رئالیسم و ناتورالیسم از مارک توین کتاب هاکلبری فینش رو بگیرین، ایندیویدوالیسم. وقتی که وارد قرن 20 میشیم، تمامی آثار نویسنده های قرن 20 از گتسبی بزرگ بگیرین که شامل ایندیویدوالیسمه تا آثار نویسنده های افریکن امریکن مثل زورا نیل هرستن، کتاب Their Eyes Were Watching God که نماد ایندیویدوالیسمه، تا حتی نویسنده های پست مدرن مثل کتاب مثلا هوم کامینگ، کتاب حتی نویسنده هایی که دورگه هستن، کتاب رین گاد از آرتورو ایسلاس. همه اینها، یعنی الان از 1820 تا آرتورو ایسلاس کتابش رو 1980 اینا نوشته تا همین قرن 20 و کتابای قرن 21، اصلی ترین چیزی که ادبیات آمریکا رو تعریف میکنه ایندیویدوالیسمه. So, and this comes from the Enlightenment. That's why I have included it in my presentation. Enlightenment created a huge interest in ordinary people, in individuals that, as I said, writers used in all forms and shapes and in all ages. And this created a kind of literature which was new. Most of the literature of the previous centuries, everyone, was religious. We have Pilgrim's Progress by John Bunyan, which was so famous. We have Paradise Lost by Milton, which is religious. But as we move into the 18th, especially the 19th century, we have so many writers, not only in America, but also all around the world, who are influenced by this Enlightenment movement and create works which focus on individuals, on the human beings. In the works of Defoe, Richardson, Henry Fielding, Lawrence Sterne, and all of the American writers I just told you about, they suddenly shift their focus on the individual, and that was the result of the Enlightenment. Even Benjamin Franklin's autobiography that focuses on himself as a perfect example of an American was influenced by this movement, of course. Let's move on very quickly to the final stage. Now, step by step, we are getting closer and closer to the independence of America. So I've talked about the earliest writings, then later on what happens, and now we are getting into the Revolutionary War period, because this was the age when the revolution was in the air. They wanted to be independent, but the question is why? Why did Americans wanted to become an independent state separate from those English, Spanish, and French monarchies? Well, let's talk about this. After winning a lot of wars, the French War, the Indian War, Britain became such a superpower in the world. And because England had engaged in different kinds of wars, it was going to be broke in a few years. So it needed money. What England did was that it asked for more and more tax from the colonies, like America, like New England. And so people who were already in New England, who had escaped England. Yeah, it was still the colony of England, but some people hated England. That's why they had gone to America. They did not want to pay any more taxes to the monarchy in England, and this created a kind of disillusionment or for dissatisfaction among the people. And that's why in one session of Congress, uh, there was a person called Richard Henry Lee, who was a representative from Virginia. He was sick and tired of this colonial practice of, because it was colonization, let's not forget it. France was colonizing America, England was colonizing America, but England was becoming more and more powerful, Britain, because they had defeated France, they had defeated the Indians, and so it was consolidating all of its colonies into one big kind of superpower. And so Henry Lee was sick and tired of this, and that's why in one session of Congress, because there was a little Congress going on, he floated a very weird idea, and he said that these united colonies. من تا حالا هی داشتم میگفتم آمریکا آقای هنری لیه، نماینده ویرجینیا، که میگه که these united colonies are and of a right ought to be free and independent states. میگه به نظر من این کلونیا باید کم کم تبدیل بشن به یک سری ایالت‌های مستقل. این یونایتد استیتس از اینجا میاد بچه ها، اگر میخوایم بدونین که اسمش از کجا اومده. And so there was another Virginian senator or a representative called Thomas Jefferson. I'm sure you have heard of Jefferson, one of the founding fathers of America, who also he loved the idea. So he collected a committee, including John Adams, a very, very famous representative from Massachusetts, as well as Benjamin Franklin from Pennsylvania, and they created what we now call the Declaration of Independence, which happened on when? The 4th of July, the Independence Day of America. پس سیرش میشه اینطوری: نارضایتی از مالیات بسیار زیاد. توی یک جلسه به اصطلاح کنگره، یه نماینده ویرجینیا به اسم ریچارد هنری لی میاد میگه که این یونایتد کالونیز باید یک یونایتد استیتس باشن و دیگه تحت سلطه مثلا مانارکی انگلیس نباشن. آقای تامس جفرسون که اهل ویرجینیا بوده خوشش میاد از این ایده، یک کمیته تشکیل میده از جان ادمز که نویسنده بوده، نماینده ماساچوستس بوده، و آقای بنجامین فرانکلین اهل پنسیلوانیا، که اینا با هم دیگه یک نسخه اولیه از Declaration of Independence رو به اصطلاح مینویسن و روز 4 جولای اون رو منتشر میکنن که معروف به روز استقلال آمریکا. What was the central argument in this? The central argument of this Declaration of Independence was that certain truths are self-evident. This is a direct quote. یه سری حقایق اصلا واضح و مبرهنن، نیازی به بحث ندارن. All men are created equal. چرا باید یه سری افراد ارباب باشن یه سری افراد برده؟ البته بردهداری ادامه پیدا کرد. این بیشتر منظورش چی بود؟ مثلا ما تحت سلطه انگلیس باشیم، اگه ما خودمون چیمون کمه. Are created equal, that they are endowed with their creator. خدا و خالقشون این قدرت رو بهشون داده. Certain unalienable rights. یک سری حقوق که زیر سوال نمیره. Unalienable یعنی حقوقی که نمیتونی از فرد بگیری. حقوق اساسیش. And among these are life, liberty and the pursuit of happiness. زندگی، آزادی و دنبال خوشبختی رفتن. The pursuit of happiness. And so this created a revolutionary war period. In January of 1776, another important work was published which fueled the Revolutionary War. پس اون کتابه، اون Declaration of Independence به عنوان یک تکست منتشر شده برامون مهمه. مقاله کامن سنس تامس پین هم برامون بسیار مهمه. پس تامس پین هم یکی از نویسنده‌های تاثیرگذاره، چون به شدت کمک کرد به اینکه همه مردم پشت این Revolutionary War بیان و تلاش کنن برای استقلال آمریکا. یه نویسنده دیگه که برامون مهمه الکساندر همیلتونه و همچنین آقای جان جی و جیمز مدیسن که یه سری مقاله می نوشتن برای روزنامه‌های نیویورکی که بعدها معروف شد به فدرالیست پیپرز، یعنی روزنامه‌هایی که بالاخره دولت فدرال آمریکا رو به اصطلاح تشکیل دادن، اون دولت مرکزی که تصمیم‌های کلی رو میگیره، حالا هر ایالت برای خودش یک دولت محلی هم داره. پس این ستا در revolution literature برای ما مهمن. دیگه شما خودتون ببینید من چه آثاری رو حذف کردم. پس میشه چی؟ Declaration of Independence، کتاب Common Sense تامس پین، مقاله های الکساندر همیلتون، جان جی و جیمز مدیسن که معروف شد به Federalist Papers. And all of this kind of revolutionary literature also created a national literature in this period. People were suddenly feeling patriotic. احساس میهندوستی توی همشون گل کرده بود. آثار نشنالیست یا ملیگرایانه به وفور یافت میشه. بهترین مثالش چیه که اینجا براتون آوردم؟ Poems written chiefly during the late war که میگم آقای فلیپ فرنو نوشته، نویسندش هم فلیپ فرنوه که اینجا براتون آوردم و اصلا تقدیمش کرده به تامس پین. یعنی انقدر تامس پین اون مقاله کامن سنسش مهم بود که تقدیمش کرده بود به آقای تامس پین. این اثر یکی از اولین آثار نشنالیستی نوشته شده است که در واقع به خاطر اون حس و حال ملیگرایی که توی مردم به وجود اومده بود در واقع نوشته شد. توی این دوره کم کم زنها هم یه اسم و رسمی برای خودشون پیدا میکنن، یه تلاش هایی انجام میدن. They also showed some kind of political sensibility. So we have so many writers who again try to write national literature. I've written so many names for you here. But of course, not a lot of people were accepting literature from women. Also important, another important thing that happened in this period was the first American novel was also published. Most of the literature produced here were narratives of discovery. They were about, for example, real things that they saw in the world. They were political essays, religious texts. But the first novel, American novel, William Hill Brown's The Power of Sympathy, was also published in this revolutionary period, and it is an epistolary novel. Just keep that in mind, that it is a novel narrated in an exchange of letters, which was Brown was highly influenced by Richardson, Samuel Richardson's Pamela especially, and Clarissa. Those two works in England, which were epistolary novels, had a huge influence on The Power of Sympathy, the first American novel. So keep that in mind. And I just want to tell you that this Power of Sympathy was not a utopian novel, okay? It was a dystopian novel portraying a very dark picture of what America is going to be like. پس این بحث national literature همش گل و بلبل نبوده، مثلا همش بگیم به به چه کشور فوق‌العاده‌ای خواهیم داشت. نه، نسخه های مثلا دیستوپین و منفی هم داشت که حالا یه مثالش میشه Power of Sympathy. آخرین نکته هم که میخواستم بهش اشاره کنم اون ایدئال هایی که براتون برشمردم مثل فریدم و فلان و اینا اینقدر میگم سرراست نبود که همه بلافاصله بهش دست پیدا کنن. خیلی از آمریکایی‌ها تا سالها و دهه‌ها بعد مثلا بوی از این فریدمه نبرده بودن، ولی خب توی اون ایدئال های اولیه‌شون بود. این هم یک خلاصه خیلی سریع از مهمترین اتفاقات و کتاب‌هایی که از ابتدای کشف آمریکا تا سال 1820 توسط تاریخ‌نگاران مختلف، نویسنده‌های مختلف و افراد تاریخی مختلف انجام شده و دیگه کارمون با این دوره تموم میشه. فقط یه دونه اثر مونده. جلسه بعدمون یک جلسه تحلیلی خواهد بود. اون چپتر از کتاب آقای برادفورد رو of Plymouth Plantation رو براتون میفرستم، باید کامل بخونید و جلسه آینده راجع به تکستش، راجع به مفاهیمی که گفته میخونیم سر کلاس، پاراگراف به پاراگراف میریم جلو و میخونیم و راجبش با هم دیگه بحث میکنیم که یک نمونه اثر نوشته شده در این دوره رو خونده باشیم. بعد ایشالا هفته بعدترش صحبتمون رو در مورد 2 هفته بعد، چون 2 هفته قراره راجع به 1820 تا 1865 با هم دیگه صحبت کنیم، راجع به یکی از فوق‌العاده ترین دوره های ادبیات آمریکا با هم دیگه صحبت خواهیم کرد. اگر سوالی چیزی دارین بچه‌ها میتونین بپرسین، اگه نه که امیدوارم روز خوبی داشته باشین. من ویدیو و پاورپوینت رو هم براتون آپلود میکنم خیلی زود که بتونین هم ویدیو رو نگاه کنین هم پاورپوینت رو یه مروری داشته باشین. اثر of Plymouth Plantation رو هم براتون میفرستم که حتما انتظار دارم که همش رو خونده باشین. خیلی ممنون از همتون که اومدین. روز خوبی داشته باشین بچه‌ها و تا هفته آینده خدا یار و نگهدارتون. مرسی.